Hello and welcome to the Leaders Council podcast, the podcast for the people who run the country and the people who keep the country running. You join us on yet another cloudy day here in the capital. I'm Matthew O'Neill, and today, as always, we ensure that we have a variety of distinct perspectives on leadership. First, we're joined by Greg Ellison, Chief Executive of the Capital International Group, a 150-plus staff, privately owned financial services business with offices in the Isle of Man and in South Africa. Greg, hello.
Hi, Matthew. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for coming on the program today. Now, normally we'd get straight over into the subject of leadership, but considering the ongoing COVID outbreak, I must ask, how has this affected your operations?
Well, it's been a pretty challenging time for the last few months, as you can imagine. When the virus really started taking a grip and affecting global markets, I was actually in South Africa, where Anthony Long, my chairman, lives, and the intention had been that I would go out there for a couple of weeks to do a week of work, and my wife and baby were with me. We were going to go and have some holiday after that. But as the virus unfolded and the impact of it became clear, it was all hands on deck. So we had to make some pretty quick and decisive decisions at that point. And once I'd done that, it was a scramble to get back to the Isle of Man before the borders closed, which they did in late March. So it wasn't quite the trip I was expecting, but the business has come through very strongly, and we live to tell the tale.
Would you say that this is going to have an effect on the economy as a whole for a long period of time?
Yeah, without a doubt, and it already is. Our business was affected in two primary ways by the pandemic. One being the significant fall in stock markets, which as an investment management business affected the assets that we manage. And secondly, interest rates around the world fell to near zero, as we saw in the UK with a rate at 0.1%, which affects the margin we make on some of our products. But more broadly in the wider economy, we've seen millions of people furloughed, unemployment rising, and people face real difficulties and challenges. And if we look back 10 years to the banking crisis, or just over 10 years, the impact of that was felt in the UK with austerity measures for many years. And I think the extent of government intervention, which has been necessary and which I applaud in the UK, but it comes at a price. And I think it's going to affect the UK, Europe, and the wider world for many years to come.
Well, it'll be interesting nonetheless to see where we end up in even a few months' time. We should move on to the subject of leadership. I always like to start this part of the conversation off by asking the same simple question. What does the word leader mean to you? Well,
at its core, it's about someone that you ask people to follow. And I think it's such an important trait for people in business. I spent many of my early years playing rugby to international level at schoolboys, and I think sport taught me an awful lot about leadership, about the importance of determination and a will to win and getting up when it hurts. And I think a lot of those traits have molded me as a leader, and I've been able to see some great leadership in action, both in the business world and on the rugby pitch. And it's very much shaped who I've become. But essentially, a leader is someone that you've got to be willing to follow, and that you do that willingly.
How would you describe your day-to-day leadership style?
I think it's very engaging. I have a very communicative style. I try to over-communicate with my directors and with the wider staff in the business. I try to give them clarity so that they understand exactly where we're going, but more importantly, why we're in business and why we're going in the direction that we go. And I try to keep them engaged and involved so that they understand the direction, but more importantly, they own their part that they play in taking us to where we want to go. And I think I spend a lot of my time therefore communicating with my directors and externally with clients and regulators and government ministers and people like that. And it's essentially what I do. It's communication and providing lots of guidance and support and coaching my colleagues as well. And I've been very fortunate during recent months where we've been in lockdown and working from home that it hasn't really changed my day-to-day activities. I still do exactly the same. I do it from my office in my home rather than my office at work. And so that's been very good.
Well, let's talk a bit about when communication does break down, because it's inevitable it will from time to time, and it usually results in conflict. What is your approach to resolving conflict?
I have a phrase that I use with the team at work, which is about dealing in truth. Often people come to a position of misunderstanding because they haven't got to the detail, they haven't got to the real nub of the issue. And I think it's important when you're faced with a misunderstanding or some potential conflict that you peel back the layers and you get to the real issue. I've seen a lot of people dealing with the kind of headlines or the surface issues, but actually, if you're able to ask questions and listen attentively, you can get under the skin of what they're saying. And when you find out what the real issue is, it's normally quite easy to solve. And I think that's the secret to it. It's getting to the real issue and dealing with the detail rather than the emotion, which can sometimes cloud these issues.
Now, let's talk a bit about developing leadership. You said that a lot of your leadership development happened on the sports pitch, which happens to quite a lot of people. But did you have any role models in addition to that within business who kind of shaped you?
Yeah, there's several. I mean, I've been very fortunate to work with some great people over the years. In my time previously, I was the managing director of Barclays Wealth for the offshore business in the Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey. And I got to interact with some incredible people there. But more broadly, I read a lot. I read a lot of literature, management and development work. I'm quite interested in some of the ideas Simon Sinek publishes. I think he had some great insights over during the coronavirus crisis, where people kept talking about what unprecedented times we were in, but actually when you break it down, yes, it's unprecedented that everyone had to lock down and work from home, and the freedoms that we take for granted were taken away from us. But actually, when you look through the lens of running a business, some of the steps we had to take to counteract those challenges were ones that we've done in the past. And I found myself reflecting recently that when Capital International was faced with the coronavirus challenge, we focused on three things, which was protecting our people, protecting our clients, and protecting our cash flows. And actually, that's a very similar approach to the one that I took 10 or 11 years earlier when I was running Barclays during the banking crisis. So I think Sinek has some good material, but I read an awful lot, and I subscribe to a website called Read It For Me, where they summarize management books every day. So it saves you having to go through all the volume, and you just pick out the key points in a 10-minute read, which is very helpful, saves time.
Now, unfortunately, our time together is quickly drawing to its close. But before I let you go, Greg, what does the next 12 months have in store for the Capital International Group?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, our immediate focus has been focusing on our clients and reassuring them and guiding them through the turbulent times that we've had over recent weeks. But the second half of the year will be heavily focused on launching a new digital corporate bank. We obtained an Isle of Man banking license a provisional banking license, I should say, in August 2019. And we're just completing the build and test phase of our digital bank. So all being well, with a fair wind, if all goes to plan, we will have the bank open by the end of 2020 and look to start taking on new clients and deposits early in 2021. So that's been a huge undertaking. We've been working on it for 4 years, and we're in the final straight now. So we're all working incredibly hard towards that. But an incredibly exciting time. It will be the first new banking license granted in 30 years in the Isle of Man, and the island's first ever digital-only bank. So you can imagine that's taking a lot of our focus and energy, but such an exciting project to be leading, and we're really excited about getting the proposition out to help our clients.
Well, Greg, I look forward to hearing more about that next time we speak, but for now, thank you.
Thank you.
That was Greg Ellison, Chief Executive of the Capital International Group. And now, if you haven't heard it before, is Jonathan White's exclusive interview with Sir Andrew Strauss.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jonathan White, and today we are joined by Sir Andrew Strauss, former captain of the England cricket team and former director of cricket at the ECB. Sir Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today.
Real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The pleasure is all of ours. You know, and you've had a distinguished career, as I said, both on and off the pitch in English cricket, recognised not least with your knighthood for services to sport just last year. So congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, there have been ups and downs in the career, like any career, including public and private disagreements with certain individuals. And on that front, I think what everybody wants to know, have you finally forgiven Marcus Trescothick for giving you that stupid Lord Brocket nickname?
Well, my recollection was that it wasn't Marcus Trescothick who gave me that nickname. It was actually Mark Butcher.
He's to blame.
I think there were a lot of people. It was the senior England teams at that time who wanted to sort of put me in my place and make sure that I didn't get above my station. So thankfully it didn't particularly stick other than within those group of players.
And you really did try and get on their nerves by getting above your station because, of course, in your first outing, you went on to score 112. Now, am I right in saying this, perhaps, that you only got there because Michael Vaughan did himself an injury?
Well, that was the reason I got on the pitch in the first place. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's often sort of misunderstood or misjudged the role that luck plays in an international career or sporting career, full stop. And, you know, I was waiting patiently in the wings for an opportunity, and it didn't really seem like an opportunity was going to come along. And then, you know, I've only got injured in the nets, and there was my chance, and I had to kind of grab it with both hands if I could.
And you certainly did. What was it like then to see your name being put up on the Lord's Honour Board after your first appearance?
Yeah, look, I'd just been transported to a completely different world almost. I was a Middlesex player, I was captain of Middlesex, all my focus was on helping Middlesex sort of win the championship and whatever. And then a week later, I've scored a test century, which is something I'd always dreamed out, you know, literally all my life. And then the thought of doing it at Lord's in your first test match. I mean, it was literally the dream. So, and then suddenly I started thinking, wow, hold on, potentially I've got a whole England career ahead of me and everything that entails. So it was a real shock to the system. But I suppose what I was grateful for was that I was relatively old, probably not the right way of putting it, but I was 27 years of age. I was pretty comfortable with my own game. And I was also, I think, mature enough to understand that this was a great opportunity for me, but not to get carried away with it, which is unfortunately what happens with a lot of younger players.
Without a doubt. And I think in those early years of your career, it's so important, I think you'd agree, especially when you're learning from other more experienced people. And this can be true of any field, whether it's sports or politics or business, to have somebody there that you can rely on or look up to for guidance. In those early days, was there somebody that you could say to this day that, thank goodness they were there for you?
Well, I think in preparing me for international cricket, Justin Langer was a massive source of advice for me. So he was captain of Middlesex a couple of years beforehand and really helped me understand what I needed to do to get there. But then I think on the day-to-day basis, my wife Ruth played a huge role, you know, just in terms of, because I think there is that real danger that you get carried away with it and you think international sport in that goldfish bowl that, you know, you're more important than you were previously, or that whole world is the real world, and obviously all we know is that the real world, nothing's changed other than other people's perception of you.
And you need that grounding. And again, that can be true of so many different areas of life.
I think so, yeah. I mean, very easy to get caught up in it and end up doing different things, being with different people, sort of trying to enjoy everything that goes with international cricket rather than focusing on the actual international cricket.
And
itself.
in those early days, Andrew, there were lots of examples where you could have got carried away because that team accomplished so much. I think for a lot of people, the 2005 Ashes series is one of the greatest sporting moments of this country's history. Now, we could chat for hours about that, but I know I wouldn't be allowed to, and you've got other places to be, so we can't do that. But if I may, I would love to ask what your highlight was personally for that, but perhaps more importantly, as a team, how were you able as a group to deal with the pressure no doubt you were feeling?
Yeah, well, the pressure is like nothing else that I experienced before or after, because, you know, I think it's easy to forget how much of a holy grail the Ashes was back then. You know, we hadn't won it for so long, and it seemed like we'd come up against these invincible Australian teams year after year. So, you know, the closer we got to it, the harder it became. I remember Ashley Giles walking into the dressing room for I think it was in the final day of the series, and I looked at him and he looked absolutely terrible, like just white of a sheet, grey. He looked like aged about 5 years. I went, God, Charlie, you're not looking too good. And he went, yeah, it's not surprising. I haven't slept for 8 weeks. And I went, well, join the club. You know, and I think we'd all been sort of living this behind our own closed doors. And yeah, it's just an extraordinary thing. And without doubt, the highlight was, number one, drawing that game at the Oval to make sure we won the Ashes, but also the day after, you know, that open-top bus parade around London, and to understand that we'd broken out of the cricket bubble, that just general sports fans or just people that were interested in seeing England win at something were all engaged and completely besotted by the whole thing.
I think that's such a key point, Andrew, because there were so many people back in 2005 that may have not even given cricket a second glance, and it put a whole new generation, especially of children, school kids, into loving that sport. And so beyond the actual competition itself, what a fantastic thing to be able to say was accomplished for
absolutely. Everything you say there is absolutely right. Like we just sort of opened the doors of cricket to a whole new generation. But probably more importantly, it was the one and only time in my life that I got papped outside a nightclub that night when we were celebrating. You know, I felt like I'd really arrived as a celebrity. Yes. It only happened for that one night, unfortunately.
But I did ask for a highlight, and if you didn't perhaps give a specific one on the pitch, so I would suggest perhaps that catch at Trent Bridge.
No. I mean, the catch at Trent Bridge was, you know, you see a ball, you stick out your hand and it goes in. I think my personal highlight was I scored 100 in that fifth test match under real pressure. And that was one that, you know, that wasn't a moment. That was a number of hours, and I had to dig pretty deep to do that.
Now, obviously, not that long later, and you were lucky enough and privileged, I'm sure, no doubt, to serve as captain. And whether you like it or not, you become the focal point of criticism. You were looked on, up to, and relied upon to be strong, especially when the going gets tough. You become a leader in many senses of the word. During your time as captain, what qualities does one require to fulfill that role?
Well, a fair amount of resilience for starters. You know, you're absolutely right. You know, I remember when I got the role, it did feel like the biggest sort of poison chalice of all time, and the, you know, sort of a litany of England captains had sort of been churned up by the job prior to me taking over. So there was that sort of realization this is going to be a tough thing to do, and you're going to have to dig pretty deep. But I think actually the most important thing was sort of just pushing all that noise to one side and just clarifying, okay, if I'm going to do this job, what is it that we really want to achieve out of this? And so suddenly that becomes a bit more exciting and a bit more enticing, the idea of, well, we can do something that's never been done before here, and I've got the opportunity to play my part in that. So, I think that was a big part of it for me. I think a lot of those qualities around leadership, I don't think you have them until you're in that situation. Absolutely. And it's very hard to prepare yourself properly for those sort of situations.
And when managing a team, you're required to manage, of course, what some people could call big personalities. Others could use different, shorter words. How poisonous can it be, when players, and indeed, and this applies again to so many different areas of life, when individuals think they are perhaps more important than a team?
Well, I think probably worth broadening out that a bit. I think there are all sorts of different people that you have to sort of contend with in a team environment, and the job of the leadership or the management is to try and sort of gel them all together and get them bought into what you're trying to do and whatever. So, there are some people that are a bit more self-absorbed. There's some people that are slightly more maverick in the way they view the world. There's some people that are very quiet. There's some people that are, perhaps very worried about what might go wrong. And so you've got to try and understand all these people individually and try and get the best out of them. But there was definitely a line there for me in terms of embracing difference up to the point where someone following their agenda was going in a completely different path from the team's agenda. And, if and when that happens, that should be a problem for a leadership. And if it isn't a problem, then you're not doing your job properly.
Absolutely. And with all that in mind, actually, and perhaps this is a bit of a mean question, but what advice would you give to others in a similar position, leading a team, being looked up to? What would be the key advice you'd give to them, and that you couldn't really do without it?
Just generally about leading a team?
I think so,
Okay,
yes.
Number one thing about leadership, I'm absolutely certain about this, is that the people you're leading need to know that you care about them. And if they genuinely believe you've got their best interests at heart, they will forgive all sorts of other inadequacies you might have, and I definitely had many, because they'll know your heart's in the right place, and they'll feel comforted. There'll be a degree of sort of psychological safety or whatever you might term to make sure that the team comes together when the going gets tough. If they genuinely don't believe you care about them and you're in it for yourself, doesn't matter how charismatic you might be. It doesn't matter, how gregarious and how impressive you might be as a person. They will be wary of you, and they will start looking after their own interests very quickly.
Now, in 2015, obviously, you were appointed as director of cricket at the ECB. You took some pretty major steps early on. You brought in Trevor Bayliss as coach, was brought in. You put a much greater emphasis on limited overs cricket. Now, in the abstract, what had you identified that needed to be changed for English cricket? And were there qualities that you had developed, you'd found out you had as England captain, that you were able to bring over the job?
Okay, so the first thing was we had this unbelievable opportunity of the World Cup on home soil in 2019. I was sick and tired of watching us make the same mistakes in World Cups, and this includes my time as captain. We just kept on sleepwalking our way into it and pretending everything would be all right on the night, and it never was. And so I definitely made it our priority to win that 2019 World Cup. I thought that was more important than anything else that was going to be taking place in my tenure. And I knew in order to do that, we had to completely shift our perception of white ball cricket.
Quite a radical shift from what we were coming from.
Yeah, but the rest of the game had moved on. And the rest of the game had understood that white ball cricket was playing an increasingly important role in both financially, but also in terms of players' focus and interest. Yes. And we had to move. In fact, we didn't have to move at times. We need to get ahead of the time. So, we had to completely shift both our philosophy, but also the way we played in order to do that. And I was very lucky having both Trevor Bayliss and Owen Morgan, who were prepared to sort of role model that and lead that through. And the second part of your question around what have the England captaincy sort of done to prepare me for the role, I think I was comfortable leading. I knew the environment. I knew what I was getting myself into. And in the early days, I could leverage some of the relationships that I had with the players. But actually, I found it a very different challenge because you are so far removed from what's going on the ground. Right. And so, you're relying on other people to have to, buy into what you want to happen and then do it themselves. And often, in different time zones in different parts of the world. So that was a very new experience for me.
Well, I think the strategy paid off, and I don't know about you, but when watching that World Cup final, again, as so many people did in this country, it's once again inspired another generation of especially school kids who, again, might not have given cricket a second look, who have now become avid cricket fans. I know of some, and what a wonderful thing that must be.
Yeah, it was an incredible day, wasn't it? I mean, I think in our vision, like when we're talking about the opportunity of winning the 2019 World Cup, I had this vision in my mind of Lords on a sunny day and a close finish and the incredible kind of, emotion that went with it. No one could have dreamt how it played out. I've never seen anything. I've never seen a game of cricket like that in my whole life, and for it to be the World Cup final was quite extraordinary. I
know some fantastically avid cricket fans who were Googling there and then what exactly the rules became, because
so was I, actually, yeah. Absolutely.
Now, Andrew, in your wife's memory, you established the Ruth Strauss Foundation last year. In doing so, whether you'd admit it or not, yourself and the foundation has become an inspiration to thousands, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. Please do take some time, if you wouldn't mind, Andrew, to explain to the listeners the work the foundation does and what it's been like to lead a project like that.
Yeah, thanks. Well, look, I mean, we obviously had a very tough journey as a family. First of all, Ruth being diagnosed. Ruth was someone that was always well. You'd never think she was going to be someone that was sort of laid down by cancer. And for us to find out that she had lung cancer was extraordinary. She'd never smoked a cigarette in her life. And I think we all had this perception of lung cancer being a smoker's disease.
Absolutely.
And so just having gone through the experience and obviously some very low times and us coming to terms with the fact that Ruth had stage 4 cancer and she was going to die, we learnt a lot in that process. And thankfully we had time for me to speak to Ruth before she died about legacy and what we could do to make something positive come out of this experience we'd all been through. And so after she died in December 2018, I came back and launched a foundation with two focuses. Number one, to fund research into these rare forms of lung cancer. These are the non-smoking lung cancers. 5,000 to 7,000 people each year in this country are diagnosed with these. No one knows why they're getting them, but they're on the increase, and it's young women that are affected more than men.
Extraordinary numbers.
Yeah, I mean, in the list of top 10 cancers, it's number 8. Rare forms of lung cancer, number 8. So it's not really rare. It's probably a misnomer, but it's, we're really lacking in funding and understanding. And then the second element, and probably this is in some ways more pressing, is to help cancer, anyone who's got cancer who has an incurable diagnosis, to help them and their families prepare themselves for death. And so in order to do that, we need to be able to find ways of them having open conversations with each other, because if you do this well, it should help the bereavement afterwards if you're well prepared for it. It's not something people like to do. I was very lucky that Ruth wanted to do it. But also we have to have that debate about the taboo of death and, effectively how uncomfortable we are talking about it, and certainly how bad we are preparing for it. If you think for a moment about antenatal classes before you have your baby, like how we're preparing you for how your life's going to change, and we do nothing around death, even though we're all going to experience it in one way, shape or form. And, I think as a society we need to be better than that. We've come a long way in so many different areas, and especially around mental health, and we can do better about death. There's no doubt about it.
Well, I think the foundation is leading the way in breaking taboos on that front, because they need to be broken. I know the foundation is going out some events later this year, so if you could tell us about some of those, that would be...
Yeah, so we've got a couple of big ones coming up. So the Westminster Mile, which is a very inclusive, if you're think about a marathon, but just think about just doing a mile of a marathon rather than 26.
Sounds ideal.
So we've got grandparents, we've got little kids, we've got people pushing prams, so that we're going to get as many people as possible to play their part in that and raise some funds. We've got the Red for Ruth Day at Lord's again, so that was an incredible day for us last year.
Whether you were there or not, especially if you were there, I mean to say, but whether it was the photos in the papers the next day, what an I think it was the 15th of April, wasn't it? What an extraordinary day, and what an overwhelming day that must have been for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, an Ashes Test match is a big day anyway, yes. And then for us to have that extra element of the Red for Ruth Day and to see the wave of support, myself and the boys were incredibly profoundly affected by that in a good way. We felt so much love and support there, and then the foundation is directly benefited hugely by the funds raised, and we want to take it up a gear this year and make it more of a community thing, not just the day at Lord's.
I even saw some of the stuffiest members of the MCC, Andrew, wearing red. So what an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, well, a lot of them wear red trousers anyway, I think. But absolutely, they were right behind us, and we really want that to be something that's embedded in the English summer, just like the McGrath Foundation Day is in Sydney in Australia. Well,
it's been a complete inspiration, and I very much hope we can talk about that perhaps late in a few months as well.
Absolutely.
Before we go, as I'm conscious of the time, it's also an exciting year for domestic cricket, not least because of the introduction of the 100, not without its critics, Andrew, I know you're a big proponent of it. The Blast has clearly shown that the short form of the game has brought cricket to a new and growing audience, exciting games. What do you say to those that ask, why do we need the 100 as well?
So the 100 is the most important step forward in domestic cricket in this country ever. And the reason for that is that increasingly, there's two things. First of all, we need to break out of the cricket bubble. So the Blast followers tend to be the same people that follow other cricket.
Right.
And therefore, that's a small audience and potentially a declining one over time, even though the Blast sales are increasing. We need to break out of that and try and get more general sports fans into cricket. But more importantly, just the way the tournament's set up, and it's one game a day over a 6-week period, broadcasters will pay money for that. And therefore, what we're trying to do is reduce our reliance on international cricket paying all the bills. If you think about Test cricket and some of the issues around the world, we just can't rely on that money coming in to fund the game. So we need to find another way of doing that. I just think it's going to be an incredible success. I'm so excited about it. I know there are people that are worried about it, but in 2 or 3 years' time, we're going to have our own short form tournament that will rival the Big Bash, and we'll be moving towards the IPL. And those are two enormous events out there, and we can have our own version of that ourselves.
I can feel your enthusiasm for it. As an Essex fan, I'm still stumped as to, I think I'm going to have to choose between either supporting a team based at the Oval or a team based at Lord's. I'll get over that, but I'll have to do it.
Well, surely it's got to be the Lord's one, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Sanju, it's been an absolute pleasure discussing that and everything else with you today. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
This has been the Leaders Council podcast. Thank you for celebrating excellence in leadership with us. I have been your host, Matthew O'Neill. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for listening to our podcast. The views expressed within the podcast do not reflect the views of the Leaders Council of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, its parent company or subsidiaries, members of staff, other guests, or any other person therein associated.